Hi. Hi, Steve.
Hi. Hi, Anna. That was great. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention that in case people are surprised to discover that Cuisenaire themselves don't do rods in wood anymore. I was in touch with them recently, and they said that the wood that they used is now quite rare, it's protected, and therefore they don't supply them in wood, which, terrible shame, isn't it, really? Because plastic is not the same. At least I don't think it is.
If we keep that secret, it might not push up the price of those what are now vintage rods.
You said you bought yours 25 years ago. I beat you, I'm afraid. I bought mine in 1980, and my original set, 1980, and they're a little bit discolored now. So I bought a new set, wooden ones, I have to say, a couple of years ago. But yeah, I mean, as you were saying, it's a fantastic investment, and they don't cost very much, really, in the great scheme of things. And what's really interesting is how many people have aunties who've got a set in the loft. Oh, those old things! I used to use those when I was a primary teacher in 1397. Yeah. And so you can often find them secondhand. In the UK, you can find them in charity shops. So yeah.
In school, I think in resource cupboards, in maths, sometimes the maths teachers use them, but then other people don't realize that they can use them too. I mean, I think they were kind of repopularized in mathematics a few years ago, where we started using Singapore bar modeling in primary schools. Yep. But people mostly bought the sort of more plasticky ones, and sometimes the ones that connect together, which aren't quite the same as these ones that are freestanding, so to speak, isn't it?
No, not the same at all. I mean, I personally, I'm against using anything but the Cuisenaire rods for rods. I don't like Lego and that kind of stuff for rods. I think if you're going to use rods, then use rods. Don't use something else. But hey, that's just me.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think, Steve, about the arguments where some people are sort of saying, oh, you can just get distracted with rods and not be focused on what's happening in front of you?
No, quite the opposite, actually. My long experience of using the rods is that people are fascinated by them, and the focus, as you said, the focus is not on the teacher. Then the focus is on these little pieces of coloured wood, and one of the things that occurred to me while you were talking was that some people might say, well, you can use the rods once every now and again, and people will be focused on them. But if you use them every day, then it wanes a little bit. But that's not my experience. My experience is that even if you do use them every day, people are fascinated by them and focus a high level of focus is experienced, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And I think that I don't think I've ever sort of seen anyone go, oh, not the rods again. There's always a really positive reaction.
I did have a woman once. I better tell people now that I'm just finishing a book on the use of the rods, and it's going to get published next year. But in that book, I mentioned this one woman who refused the rods. One woman in thousands and thousands of teachers and decades of teaching, and I produced them. I was there as a kind of temporary teacher, really, with an adult class. And as soon as she saw them, she shrunk away from them. And I had a chat with her afterwards, and she said, "Is there a problem?" And she said, "Well, yes, there is." She didn't say it like that. I'm not going to do her accent. She said, "Yeah, there is a problem." And I said, "Well, why?" And she said, "Well, they're for children." I said, "Well, if you give me a chance, I'll show you that they're not." And she said, "No, I'm not going to do that because I only like to learn English from literature." So her way of learning was to read literature, which, is absolutely fine. I have no problem with it. You can learn by watching crocodiles swim if you want to. I don't care. But
she's never had my Macbeth and Rod's lesson then, Shakespeare, third conditional, and Rod's is a match made in heaven. All those tragedies. It's just
it is, except when you meet a student who actually uses to boot, which I did once. And I said, where did you find that? And he said, I found it in Shakespeare.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, now I have a question for you, actually, Anna. And that is that you use colors for parts of speech. You use colors in your syntax work. And personally, I find that really confusing. I don't do it. And I wanted to ask you whether you've ever had students who spend time trying to remember what the associated color is, rather than actually working on the language. Is that a problem or not?
I think I never get them to do it as a memory thing, because if I was doing that in a face-to-face classroom, I also have the magnetic Cuisenaire rods that you can stick to the board behind me. So I would have the key on the board.
Now you're just showing off.
Well, if you're doing it with a handout, I would always have, sometimes I have little laminated color ones. So it's like having a box of chocolates, isn't it? There's your map. And you keep that as reference all the time. So I wouldn't ever expect a student to remember, oh, red is the auxiliary or whatever it is.
Oh, okay.
I do tend also, I've got lots of boxes of just cheap crayons, which always have all the Cuisenaire colours in. And you can put a box of crayons on the table and you give them straight away sort of a black and white handout, and we sort of colour in what they're going to be. And I try to keep them the same. And again, online, I would keep it the same. So I would hope that people are not trying to memorize. I don't necessarily always have a particular pattern. So one thing I think when I do conditionals, I'm thinking, oh, which one do I want to be the perfect infinitive? Which one do I want to be the past participle? It seems now in my mind, when I said the word past participle to you, I can see a brown rod. So I've started to associate it with that color. And every time it's an object, it's yellow. But that's just kind of because I've done some of the tasks that work well many times, and I just stick to the same code for my own sanity, really. Other teachers might have different color codes.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, okay, thanks, good. Now, I was a little bit worried about that because I don't have that my mind doesn't work like that. And I wondered whether you'd experienced problems, but you've explained that it isn't a problem in that particular regard. Yeah. A comment on dogme. Yeah. That you mentioned. I'm going to slightly disagree with you, I think, although we can battle it out with boxing gloves when we meet in southern Italy.
Or agree. Let's see what you disagree with.
I disagree in a rather technical sense that dogma, as I understand it at least, is about using the resources that are either already in the classroom or the students bring in with them. And I don't think that rods, because rods is a material aid, and you bring it in with the intention of using it. And therefore, I'm not sure that, for me at least, I'm not sure that it fits within the umbrella of dogme. That's my objection. I think
that's absolutely true. On the other hand, I would say, I guess it depends what you would have with you, because, for example, my teaching bag always has Cuisenaire rods in, but it wouldn't have a Coke can. And in Scott Thornbury's Teaching Unplugged, he goes to great lengths to explain a lesson that you just happen to randomly have a Coke can and you take that out. That wouldn't be something that I would naturally have on me, because I'm not a huge fan of fizzy drinks. So yeah, no, it's absolutely true. I think it's taking the idea of just the sort of the unplugged idea of it and the kind of more minimalist approach of it. And also, I would say, as a teacher, I would admit I like the security blanket of the Cuisenaire rod because it has a very specific meaning to me, but it can be many things. I'm quite afraid as a teacher, despite years of experience, to just go in with absolutely nothing. It's not my style. I like things. So dogme actually is quite a sort of scary thing for me, trying to do that. And it's interesting because by far some of the best lessons do come definitely out of emergent language. But for me, as a long-term syllabus, that's not really easily sustainable. I think as one-off lessons here and there. And I think I'm always mindful that students are basically, they're our clients, they're our customers, they pay for a service. And there is a certain expectation, isn't it? They want a book, they want something. So for how long can you get away with sort of nothing?
Forever. Can I give you a quick anecdote? I hope people aren't bored by this toing and froing between us, but I don't see any questions coming up.
No, go ahead. I can't wait to.
When I was running initial teacher training courses at a university, a colleague of mine and I used to give each other an object before we went into to teach a class. That is not a teacher training class, but a demonstration class with actual learners. And one day, this friend of mine, he gave me a ski hat, a woolen ski hat, right? So the idea was that you go in and you invent a lesson around this thing. It was fantastic training. I recommend it. So I went in with this ski hat and I said, hello, everybody. And they went, and I said, what's this? And they said, I said, well, okay. Is it a hat? They said, no, hat. I said, whose hat is it? They said, don't know. I said, okay, is it my hat? Don't know. Is it, do you think my granny made it? Maybe, don't know. And that's the way it went. And it was absolutely disastrous, but fantastic training, because it sharpens you up and it makes you actually not, once you've done that, you're not afraid of anything. And that nothing that can happen in the classroom is going to ever phase you again.
Yeah, I think going out of your comfort zone is important. And I always find it interesting how some people find Cuisenaire rods are out of their comfort zone, because for me, I just feel so comfortable with them. Even the first time I sort of saw them, I just thought this is something I can get my hands literally around and my head around and enjoy experimenting with. And, I think obviously there are certain things, if you're showing syntax of a sentence and it needs to be done in a certain way to be accurately and correct, but there are so many other things like the storytelling and the nature of that there's just so much flexibility. Yeah. I believe, Steve, am I right in saying that I think you were privileged enough to meet Caleb Gattegno? Is that right?
Not only meet him, but I was trained by him and worked with him afterwards. I knew him I knew him right up until his death. In fact,
could you share what that experience was like? Because watching The Silent Way online with other teachers, I wonder if that's still got the same spirit of what he intended with The Silent Way.
I think if I'm going to be absolutely honest, I'm going to say that most of the stuff that you can find online is actually nothing to do with Silent Way. Silent Way is extremely complex, and it's very much more than being silent, and it's very much more than using the rods. It's a whole philosophy, and it's about some very deep thinking to do with student responsibility, to do with awareness and awarenesses, so the plural of awareness, which isn't very often used. And it's a very, it's an austere and extremely challenging approach, both for teacher and student. There is a myth that Silent Way teachers don't guide their students. They do. There's also a myth that Silent Way teachers are always silent. They're not. Gattegno said, in my hearing, when somebody asked him why Silent Way was called Silent Way, he said, "Why should I speak when my students can?" So that was his answer to. So the silence is all about giving space to students. The rods themselves, I've got to say that Gattegno himself was never a master of the rods. This sounds terribly arrogant of me, and I recognize that, but he used them in very, very limited ways to do certain limited things, and he did it like a master. Nobody else could do that. But there are many people, including Adrian Underhill, with whom I've also had the privilege of working, who've taken those ideas much, much further than Gattegno ever did. So let's not confuse using the rods with Silent Way. If you want to be a Silent Way teacher, you must be trained. There's no question. One can't simply say, I'm not going to speak anymore, I'm going to be a Silent Way teacher. That's not what it's about.
Technical, isn't it? You do need to know about the pronunciation charts and the color codes. And also I wondered, I did have a lot of explore online, but I didn't get a concrete answer, and I don't know if you have it, of why they are called Fidel charts. Somebody said it was an acronym for something, and I don't remember.
No, it's not. It's I believe it's an Ethiopian. I'm just trying to find it. If I can share my screen, just let me see if I can do this. Right, this is the color code. This is the color chart that I have created, and to avoid having students wonder what the sound, you have to try and remember the colors and the sounds.
Is
I've
that
attached.
book?
Sorry?
Is that going to be in your book?
No, it isn't, because this is about Silent Way and the book is about the rods. But if anybody wants this, I'm happy to send it to you.
Yeah, that
because it's very, very difficult to remember all that stuff. It takes years to do it, I believe.
Yeah.
The word fidel, Gattegno told me once a long time ago. Let's see if I can get the screen back to where it's supposed to be now. Oh God, I've got lost. I really have got lost. I don't know where I am now. How do I make the screen large again?
Or do you want to stop sharing, or you?
Oh yeah, that's it. Okay, got it. Thank you. He said that he was working for the UN in Ethiopia, and he told me that fidel was a word which comes from an Ethiopian dialect. And to be honest with you, right now I can't remember what it means, but it was just, it was one of those things
that he had.
Yeah, so it's not an acronym, not an acronym. Gattegno spoke many languages, and he would say to people, how many languages do you speak? And they would say 2 or 3 or whatever, and he'd say, why don't you speak 10? and that was his way of saying, you can do a lot more than you're doing. And that's also part of the expectation that you have for students. I'm sorry, this is turning into a Silent Way lecture. I'm going to stop in a second.
No, it's very interesting. Don't stop.
Expectation that you have for students drives them forward. It's a silent expectation. You don't say to students, I know you can do this. I know you can do more than this. I know you're fantastic. The praise isn't part of Silent Way. It's got nothing to do with Silent Way. And that's a debate that can be had, whether one should praise or not. I do it very, very rarely. But Gattegno never did. And students find their own inner strength from that lack of customary, what a clever chap you are. All that, I call that nonsense. It's all nonsense. And that comes directly from Silent Way. And his thinking that if you expect lots and you're naturally exuding the idea that people can do loads of stuff, then they will.
Yeah, absolutely. So really, I think what you've just said explains why I personally haven't felt confident in trying to replicate the Silent Way, because basically you do need a lot of training and expertise to do it properly. And really, if we're just giving the rods to students as a suggestion and not talking much, that's really a tiny tip of the iceberg of what that methodology is really about.
Yes, I agree with that, which kind of leads me into something else that I wanted to talk to you or with you about, and that was eliciting. Silent Way teachers use language, but they use it in a percentage-wise, in the sense that if I use one word, I expect to have 10 back, and therefore telling if I'm doing a rod story, for example, I say very, very little indeed. I set context and I get students to tell me. And I wondered whether you were limited by, I wondered whether the way that you did that today on your presentation is the way you do it, or whether you are limited by the context that we're in now. So you felt the need to tell the story yourself.
Yeah, I think when you're in a face-to-face classroom, the story is much more flexible and emergent, because I interact with the people in the room. So I make a lot more eye contact, and also I ask a lot of questions to people. So I'm sort of saying to them, so what do you think is going to happen next? Where could these people be? What are they doing? And therefore the story is not always going to be the same. I think that does mean as well that if you were sometimes you're trying to produce a story that then leads onto a worksheet. So if I go way too far off what it is, then what the students see on the worksheet afterwards doesn't reflect it. But I do have other versions of stories where I then ask the students to write the story, and therefore it can be whatever was said. So yes, I think once you're online, that more interactive, emergent thing is lost, unless you are, well, in the webinar, obviously I was sort of talking to myself, but yes. If you've got people at the other end that can interact with you, then you can still build that. But I think the real joy of the rods is when the students can also move and touch them and manipulate them at the same time. So it's a much more collaborative affair rather than I'm going to deliver this. I do enjoy those ready-made stories because they're just great fun and very memorable, but I rarely tell them in exactly the same way. And in fact, often before I tell them, I need to read the worksheet to try and bring myself back to the original a little bit to make sure I don't deviate too much if I want to give out the actual worksheet.
Yeah. Okay, great. I think there's a question. Oh, no, you've answered it there. How often do you use the rods with
rods with the same group? I think I use rods loads and loads of times with the same group because in my experience, mostly things are really, students enjoy them. Once they've done it once, they are keen to have another go. And also they're great for revising things. So particularly if you did a story using the third conditional, you could give the rods a week later, and the likelihood is that they're going to remember most of it, and that will really trigger, you know, all those neural pathways that they're going to think, oh yes, that was the character John, and these were the officers, and those little white rods, what did they represent? They represented ideas, and they represented CVs, and they represented work. So I think that you can, I think you said as well, you've used them more than once with the same class. I think students, in my experience, people often ask to use them as well.
Yeah. I was writing something today and I realized that I couldn't actually remember a class where I hadn't used the rods. So I've used them right the way through my career as a mainstay, as the main material. I mean, I hate textbooks. I've only ever found one going back a very long time that I actually liked. And so I've avoided them all the way through my career, and the rods have taken their place instead.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also when I get the, I don't very often get to teach students long term anymore. I dip in and out and do a lot of teacher train, but absolutely when I get a class that I'm going to see for any period of time, they're unlikely to escape the use of the rods with me. Definitely, because it's by far one of my favorite tools. And I think also with a textbook, I mean, textbooks have their place, they're useful, but there's just so much amazing real stuff out there in the world. It just seems to be a bit of a shame to straitjacket yourself into something. Although I would say, I mean, there are some books that I really like some of the National Geographic books, because the photography and the color and the sort of that whole world experience is really important to me. I think teaching in a kind of cross-curricular way as well is interesting.
Yeah. But you can use resource materials, can't you, for that kind of stuff? I mean, you can use National Geographics or whatever you want for that. You don't have to. What I dislike about, well, there are many things I dislike about textbooks, but the main one really is that it's so atomistic. I mean, you get the whole idea of going from the simple present through the present continuous to the simple past I mean, all that stuff. I mean, we should be well beyond that by now. We shouldn't be thinking in those hierarchical grammar ways, structural ways. We should be doing something quite different.
I wonder if you can say that easily, though, because you've got a lot of experience. But when we have maybe inexperienced teachers, they crutch of the, but you don't feel that sometimes that's
no. On the contrary, when I was trained, I was very lucky. I do say I was extremely lucky and thankful. I've always been to Adrian Underhill and his team at IH Hastings in the late 70s and early 80s. But they trained us in such a way that we didn't get to see a textbook. I was encouraged to go into the classroom without an idea in my head, literally. And to see what happened, and it was brilliant. It freed me up for all that stuff, and now I'm able to use a textbook if I absolutely have to, but I can also go into a room without anything at all, and with luck, make a decent lesson.
I think textbooks sometimes can be a little bit inspirational, though, in the sense of as a recipe book, because when I cook, I often look at recipe books, I get an idea, but once I actually get into my kitchen, I haven't taken the book with me. I've just taken the sort of essence of the ideas, and the quantities can be flexible. If there's a missing ingredient, it doesn't matter. And then you get something that is loosely based on. So that's how course books work for me. They're often a springboard for something, but usually I might start with a little pinch of course book, but the rest of it's going to be about real world and students and me, to see.
Yeah. So, no, I quite like that. I like that idea of course books as being a kind of a springboard, something to glance at and give you an idea before you go in. But further than that, I've resisted them, and I still resist them.
Yeah. There was a guy I worked with in Italy a long time ago who had made an amazing book, which was made up of loads of different coloured sort of flip cards, and you could kind of open it at any page and it created all different elements of a lesson, like those little books where you move the pictures quite fast and you get different images. And that was quite an interesting way to look at things. But we're digressing from the rods. I see that
We are.
Heather's saying that she's using, I talked about in my last webinar about using rods for the academic writing in IELTS. I think for bar charts and things like that, that's quite useful. I think bars, graphs and things like that can be easily constructed, and it's nice for sort of speaking tasks too. I was wondering though, Steve, have you used, especially if you work with Adrian Underhill, have you used the rods for pronunciation as well?
Not specifically, no. One of the other things that I'm saying in my book, another plug there, is that sometimes there are better ways to do things than using the rods. And pronunciation for me, I use a chart. I was taught to do that by the wonderful Adrian Underhill. Silent modeling of sounds and so on. And I use the rods for stress.
Yeah,
as in a way that's very similar to yours, except that I only use red rods for words. I don't do the thing that you do with the colors for different parts of speech. And I use white rods for contractions, and then for stress, I stand the red rod up. That's all. That's all I do. And it's worth saying to people who haven't done this that when you do that, you work from your right to, if you're teaching English as opposed to Arabic or Hebrew, you work from your right to your left. So students watching from the other side are able to read in the direction that they actually would read. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that is very important, isn't it? I often find that if I was doing something like that, I would be with the table and the students stood around me sort of in a circle more or less. So I wonder if I'm mindful of whether I'm going from left to right or right to left, to be honest. But I think that is a really important point. It was interesting as well watching what you see when you've recorded a work, because I think this also leads into the difference between sort of asynchronous and synchronous teaching, that when something is asynchronous, you can record it and you can polish it and you can perfect it. So I think if I was deliberately telling those stories, I might look at the perspective that the students have got, because you're facing the rods with the story where you are, but perhaps you need to do it with a mirror in front of you to see whether that story is being projected in the same way. Obviously, absolutely. Synchronous.
Sorry, we got a little lag. I always tell teachers who want to start using the rods to buy a mirror, a kind of stand-up mirror if they can, and when they first open their brand new box of rods, to put the mirror there and look at the mirror, look at what they're doing, because that's the audience, that's who you're working for. It's not for you. It's when you get onto things, very simple ideas like preposition to position and things like this. You know, what is behind? Are we talking about behind for me or behind for them? And of course, it should be behind for them, and left and right and in front of, and all that stuff has to be designed for them to see stuff, not for you.
Absolutely. And it's also that perspective, isn't it? What is on top and above and parallel to. It's a bit like, I think you're making me think about my Pilates teacher. I know that she, one of the lessons I go to, she doesn't have a mirror, and she's really mindful of, is it our left or her left, and which way are you doing it? And I think that is really, really important, because that it causes so much unnecessary confusion, doesn't it? If you're not doing the same thing.
Absolutely, especially if you're working in a language which is not yours.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Yeah. And prepositions, if you get it right, can be so easily demonstrated with the rods.
Absolutely.
So clearly. Yeah. And have you tried yourself? I guess, I don't know whether you've had the opportunity to try and record using rods, or you've just face to face. I've done face-to-face recordings, in the sense that I've had classes recorded. I was looking at one this afternoon. Actually, I did a class of Italian with some Peruvian teachers, and that was just that was a basically silent way, but using the rods, of course.
Yes. And that's interesting. Then you look back at yourself and you think, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. Oh, I could have done this better. But at the time, you do what is natural. You do what you feel is right. And you used the word perfection just now. You polish it to perfection, I think you said. And I don't think I could ever achieve that, because, I mean, yeah, I don't want to harp on, but going back to this book, I do want to harp on, actually. Going back to this book, I started this book in more than 20 years ago. And I've had to go back over the various chapters so many times, because I've said things that I no longer agree with. So that what I'm trying to say is that what you do at a given moment is what you do at a given moment.
And that's really valid, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you may learn more, and that's the case for me anyway. Since I started writing this, I've changed my mind about so many things, and I've learned more. And so I can, in a valid sort of way, I think I can go back and change it. But if you're looking at a class that you taught, whatever you did was right.
Yeah, for that moment,
right.
that time, definitely. Because I think also with these webinars, when you're telling the story, you think, oh, I could record this again, I could do it differently, I could do it better, but I tend to prefer to kind of not over rehearse it, just go for it. And also, I think it doesn't matter if it's not completely perfect, because that's not, students aren't remembering those slips. They're much more focused on the more global experience anyway. I think we can all, I think it would not be good for our mental health if you keep going on and keep looking at things and watching it and picking holes in it, but you have to sort of go back and think, well, yeah, definitely, what was the interesting part? What was the positive? And maybe next time I'll do it differently, or maybe next time I will actually do it almost identically, because actually that wasn't so bad.
Yeah, I agree with you. I also, I'm just going to put a light on because I'm getting a bit dark here, I see. I also think this links in with a little bit, at least, with the idea of students leaving a class with everything neatly wrapped up in a. Oh, there's another light. Blimey, I've got so much light going on now. Students leaving a class with everything totally wrapped up and absolutely understanding everything from beginning to end. And I don't go for that. I don't think that's necessarily a positive thing. I like students to leave with some confusion, what I call positive confusion. So they're still asking themselves questions about how does that actually work? Was that really there? And then so on. And then maybe next time, over a period of hours or days or whatever it is between lessons, they may very well sort that out for themselves. And that's really what I want.
The time that they're ready. I think that's a great point to end on, just people being sort of tolerant of ambiguity and learning to live with that, because that's what life is all about as well, isn't it? We end on a philosophical note, Steve.